In the shadowed annals of human cruelty, where the machinery of state power ground against the resilience of the human spirit, few stories possess the haunting magnitude of what transpired in York, England, during the spring of 1586. This is not merely a tale of religious persecution, though faith played its undeniable role. This is the account of Margaret Clitherow, a woman whose refusal to speak would condemn her to an ordeal so prolonged, so methodically calculated, that it would become a watershed moment in the evolution of justice itself. What you are about to hear challenges our understanding of human endurance and forces us to confront the darkest capabilities of organized punishment. The execution of Margaret Clitherow stands as a grotesque pinnacle of judicial torture, not because of its brutality alone, but because of its duration and the calculated precision with which it was administered. For 72 hours, this woman remained conscious as her body was systematically crushed beneath increasing weights, her suffering prolonged by medical intervention designed not to save her life, but to extend her dying. The very physicians sworn to heal were transformed into instruments of prolonged agony, their knowledge weaponized to ensure that death would not come swiftly as a merciful release. What makes Margaret's story particularly significant in the broader context of human rights is not simply the horror of her death, but the ripple effects it created. Her execution became a catalyst for legal reform, a cautionary tale invoked in debates about the limits of state power, and ultimately a cornerstone in arguments against cruel and unusual punishment. The echoes of her suffering would resonate through centuries, influencing the very language used in constitutional protections against torture. But before we delve into the mechanics of her death, we must understand the woman herself and the world that condemned her. Margaret was not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. She did not lead armies or pen manifestos. Her crime was quieter, more intimate, yet in the eyes of Elizabethan England, equally dangerous. She provided sanctuary to Catholic priests at a time when such an act was considered high treason, punishable by death. The year 1586 was a pivotal moment in English history. Queen Elizabeth I had survived multiple assassination plots, each one allegedly involving Catholic conspirators. The Spanish threat loomed large on the horizon, and paranoia about internal enemies had reached fever pitch. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, Catholics were viewed not merely as religious dissenters, but as potential traitors, fifth columnists waiting to overthrow the Protestant state from within. Margaret Clitherow lived in York, a city that had once been a stronghold of Catholic faith, but now found itself at the mercy of aggressive Protestant enforcement. She was a butcher's wife, a mother of 3 children, respected in her community despite her known Catholic sympathies. Her home became a secret chapel, a hiding place for priests who risked their lives to minister to those who refused to abandon the old faith. This was Margaret's quiet resistance, the opening of her door, the sharing of her bread, the whispered prayers in hidden rooms. What she could not have known, as she went about her clandestine ministry, was that her name had already been marked. Informers had been watching. The authorities were building their case, and when they finally came for her on March 10th, they came not just to arrest a woman, but to make an example that would resonate throughout the kingdom. The machinery of terror was about to demonstrate its most elaborate performance, and Margaret Clitherow would be its unwilling star. The trial that followed her arrest was a peculiar affair, notable not for what was said, but for what was deliberately left unsaid. Margaret stood before the judges, accused of harboring priests and hearing mass, crimes that carried the penalty of death. But rather than enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, Margaret made a choice that would seal her fate in the most horrific manner imaginable. She refused to plead at all. This was not a gesture of contempt, though it might appear so to modern eyes. It was an act of calculated sacrifice, the world that condemned her. To understand the mechanism that would destroy Margaret Clitherow, we must first understand the England of 1586, a nation convulsed by religious warfare and political paranoia. The English Reformation had begun more than 50 years earlier when Henry VIII broke with Rome, but the settlement remained fragile, contested, and blood-stained. Elizabeth II's accession to the throne in 1558 had brought a Protestant restoration after the brief and brutal Catholic reign of her half-sister Mary. But Elizabeth's Protestant settlement satisfied neither the radical Puritans who wanted to purge all Catholic remnants, nor the Catholics who viewed her as a heretic usurper. The 1570s and 1580s saw an escalation in anti-Catholic legislation that transformed religious dissent into high treason. The papal bull of excommunication issued against Elizabeth in 1570 had declared her a heretic and absolved her subjects of allegiance to her. This made every Catholic a potential traitor in the eyes of the state. Parliament responded with a series of increasingly draconian laws. To reconcile someone to the Catholic faith became treason. To harbor a priest became a capital offense. Even to own Catholic religious items could result in imprisonment, fines, or worse. The seminary priests, trained in Catholic colleges on the continent and smuggled back into England to minister to the faithful, were hunted with the same fervor that would later characterize witch hunts. Networks of informers, encouraged by substantial bounties, infiltrated Catholic communities. Priest holes, hidden chambers built into the walls of sympathetic homes, became necessary architecture for survival. Families lived in constant fear that a knock on the door might herald not neighbors but pursuivants, the armed agents tasked with rooting out recusants. York itself held particular significance in this religious conflict. It had been the epicenter of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, the largest popular uprising against the Reformation. Though that rebellion had been crushed with savage efficiency, the city retained a reputation for Catholic sympathy. The Council of the North, headquartered in York, was charged with enforcing religious conformity throughout the region. Their methods were ruthless. Public executions of priests and recusants were staged with theatrical brutality, designed to terrorize the population into compliance. Within this context, Margaret Clitherow's activities were not simply illegal, they were inflammatory. Her husband, John, though not a practicing Catholic himself, tolerated her faith, a dangerous compromise in an age that demanded absolute conformity. Her stepchildren from John's first marriage had been sent to Catholic schools abroad, another mark against the household. Margaret's own children were being raised in the faith, despite laws requiring attendance at Protestant services. The authorities had been aware of her for years, but had lacked sufficient evidence, or perhaps sufficient will, to move against a respected tradesman's wife. What changed in early 1586 was the political temperature. The Babington Plot, a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne, had been recently uncovered. Though the plot would not reach its climax until later that year, rumors and partial revelations had already heightened Protestant paranoia. The government needed to demonstrate its vigilance, its willingness to strike at Catholics high and low. Margaret, with her known activities and her refusal to hide her faith, became a convenient target. She was respectable enough that her prosecution would send a message, but not so well connected that political complications would arise. The raid on her home was conducted with military precision. Pursuivants surrounded the house while others forced entry, searching every room, probing walls for hiding places. They found what they were looking for, evidence of Catholic worship, but not the priests themselves who had been warned and fled. What they did find was enough: vestments, chalices, books, and most damningly, the testimony of witnesses who could place priests in her home. Margaret was arrested on the spot, her children left in the care of neighbors as she was dragged away to York Castle. The cell that became her temporary home was dank and cold, typical of prison accommodations for those accused of treason. She was allowed no visitors, save the priests sent to convince her to conform, to take the oath of supremacy acknowledging Elizabeth as head of the church. Margaret refused every entreaty. She knew what awaited her, yet she remained resolute. What she could not have anticipated was the specific horror that her silence would trigger, a punishment so arcane that it had rarely been employed, and never to the extreme that would soon be applied to her. The silence that sealed her fate. Margaret Clitherow's trial began on March 15th, 5 days after her arrest. The court was held in York's Guildhall, a space that had witnessed countless judgments but few as consequential as this. The presiding judges included some of the most senior legal minds in the North, men tasked with demonstrating the Crown's authority. The charges were read: harboring priests, attending Mass, reconciling others to the Catholic faith. Each charge carried the death penalty. The evidence was presented, testimony from informers and servants, the physical evidence seized from her home. It was, by the standards of the day, an open and shut case. Then came the moment when Margaret was asked to enter her plea. Would she declare herself guilty or not guilty? The court waited. The spectators leaned forward, and Margaret said nothing. Not in defiance, not in confusion, but in deliberate, calculated silence. The judges repeated the question. Again, silence. They warned her of the consequences. She remained mute. This was not a common occurrence, but neither was it unprecedented. What Margaret had chosen was muta by malice, the refusal to plead, and it triggered one of the most savage procedures in English law: peine, forte, dure, pressing to death. Why would Margaret choose this path? The answer lies in the legal peculiarities of English treason law. If she pleaded and was found guilty, as she certainly would be, her property would be forfeited to the Crown. Her husband would be left destitute. Her children would inherit nothing. But if she refused to plead, if she was never actually tried, then legally she was never convicted. Her property would remain intact. Her family would be protected. Margaret's silence was not stubbornness but strategy, a mother's final act of provision for her children. She was willing to endure unimaginable suffering to ensure their survival. But there was another layer to her refusal. By not pleading, Margaret prevented a trial from proceeding. A trial would require witnesses. Under English law at the time, family members could be compelled to testify against the accused. Margaret's children, her servants, her husband himself could be forced to give evidence that would condemn her. By refusing to plead, she spared them that moral agony. She would not allow her children to be made instruments of her death. This was an act of extraordinary maternal protection, though it came at a cost almost too terrible to contemplate. The judges conferred. This was an unusual situation, though provisions existed for it. Peine, forte, dure was the prescribed remedy for those who refused to plead. The procedure was simple in theory. The accused would be laid on the ground, a board placed upon their body, and weights added until they agreed to plead, or until they died. In practice, it was usually brief. Most people pleaded after the first weights were applied. Those who didn't typically died within hours. The punishment was meant to be coercive, not prolonged. Death was supposed to come quickly, either through suffocation as the lungs collapsed, or through internal injuries as the ribs broke. What happened next, according to the historical accounts that would later emerge, represented a departure from standard procedure. Orders arrived from London, from the highest levels of government, possibly from the Queen's Council itself. These orders specified that Margaret's pressing was to be carried out under medical supervision. A physician was to be present, monitoring her condition. The weights were to be increased gradually, at specified intervals. The goal, it seemed, was not a swift death, but a prolonged demonstration, a spectacle of suffering designed to break not just Margaret, but the will of any who might follow her example. The specificity of these orders suggests premeditation at the highest levels. This was not a spontaneous decision by local authorities, but a calculated policy implemented from the center of power. Someone, perhaps Elizabeth herself, perhaps her chief minister Lord Burghley, perhaps the more zealous members of her Privy Council, had decided that Margaret Clitherow's death would be exemplary in the most literal sense. She would be made an example of, her suffering prolonged and publicized as a warning. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy the state, who choose Rome over England, who put conscience above obedience. Margaret was given one final chance to recant. She was visited in her cell by Protestant ministers who pleaded with her to save herself, to acknowledge Elizabeth's supremacy, to renounce her Catholic faith. She refused with quiet dignity. When asked if she feared death, she replied that she feared only dying in sin. When reminded of her children, she said she had given them to God. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no dramatic conversion. Margaret had made her choice, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited her. The date was set, March 25th, Lady Day, the Feast of the Annunciation. The location would be the toll booth on Euse Bridge, a public space where her suffering would be visible to all. The machinery of prolonged death. Dawn broke cold and grey over York on March 25th. The city had been abuzz with rumours for days. A pressing was rare enough, but the whispers suggested something more elaborate, more terrible than the usual swift procedure. Crowds began gathering at the toll booth well before the appointed hour. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others from genuine concern for Margaret, still others at the authorities' encouragement, for this was meant to be a public lesson. The space had been prepared with grim efficiency: a wooden platform, a heavy door to serve as the pressing board, and an array of stones and weights arranged in graduated sizes. Margaret was brought forth shortly after dawn. Contemporary accounts describe her as composed, even serene, her face pale but calm. She'd been allowed to dress in a simple linen shift, the clothing she would wear to her death. As she was led to the platform, she prayed quietly, her lips moving in familiar Latin cadences. The executioners, professional men accustomed to their work, seemed uneasy. This was not a hanging or a beheading, quick deaths they had administered many times. This would be different, slower, and they had been given explicit instructions about the pacing. The physician arrived shortly after, a man whose name has not survived in the records, but whose role would prove crucial. He carried a bag of instruments, tools for monitoring life, rather than ending it. He checked Margaret's pulse, examined her eyes, listened to her breathing. He would do this repeatedly over the coming hours and days, ensuring that she remained conscious, that death did not come too quickly. His presence transformed an execution into a medical experiment, a calibrated study in how long a human being could endure being crushed. Margaret was instructed to lie down on the platform. She did so without resistance, stretching out on her back as directed. Her arms were extended to either side and bound to stakes driven into the platform. The heavy wooden door was then placed upon her body, covering her from shoulders to thighs. The first weights were brought forward, relatively modest stones that were placed on the door. Even these initial weights caused visible distress. Margaret's breathing became labored, her ribs compressing under the load, but she did not cry out. Instead, she began to pray aloud, her voice strained but clear. The instructions specified that weights were to be added in stages, with intervals between each addition. The first interval was set at 4 hours. For 4 hours, Margaret lay beneath that initial load, her body adjusting to the pressure, her lungs working against the constriction. The physician monitored her constantly, checking her pulse at the wrists and neck, observing the color of her lips and fingernails, ensuring she remained conscious. When the 4 hours elapsed, more weights were added. The door creaked under the increased load. Margaret's breathing became even more labored, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of fluid beginning to accumulate in her compressed lungs. Contemporary accounts, compiled from witness testimony given years later, describe Margaret's behavior during these early hours as extraordinary. She did not curse her executioners or the judges who had condemned her. She did not beg for mercy or cry out in pain. Instead, she prayed. She recited psalms, Ave Marias, the Pater Noster. When her voice grew too weak for words, she hummed hymns. The crowd, initially hostile or indifferent, began to shift. People wept. Some joined in her prayers, risking their own safety by publicly participating in Catholic devotions. The executioners themselves were visibly disturbed, but they had their orders. By the end of the first day, Margaret had endured more than 12 hours under increasing weight. The physician reported that she remained conscious, though in severe distress. Her ribs had begun to crack, audible pops that made the crowd flinch. Fluid was filling her lungs, causing a gurgling sound with each labored breath, yet she was still alive, still aware. The decision was made to continue through the night. Torches were lit around the platform. Guards were posted to keep the crowd at a distance, but also to ensure the crowd remained, for this was meant to be witnessed. Through that first endless night, Margaret's suffering intensified. The cold added another dimension of torment. The weight on her chest made sleep impossible, though exhaustion pulled at her consciousness. The physician administered small amounts of water, not to comfort her, but to keep her alive, to prevent dehydration from hastening death. Every few hours, more weights were added according to the prescribed schedule. By dawn of the second day, she had been under the press for 24 hours. Her body had begun to show the catastrophic effects of prolonged crushing. Her extremities were purple from circulatory compromise, her face swollen, her breathing reduced to shallow gasps. But her heart still beat, her eyes still moved, following the faces of those around her. She remained conscious, trapped in her disintegrating body, unable to escape into death. The calculated science of suffering. As the second day of Margaret's ordeal began, the physician's role became increasingly central to the horror unfolding on Ouse Bridge. This unnamed medical practitioner, trained in the healing arts, had been transformed into an architect of prolonged agony. His examinations grew more frequent as Margaret's condition deteriorated. He would approach the platform, kneel beside her head, and conduct his assessments with clinical detachment. Pulse rate, respiratory pattern, pupillary response, color of the mucous membranes. Each observation was recorded, each finding used to calibrate the next addition of weight. The science of keeping someone conscious during crushing is gruesomely precise. The human body, faced with the progressive compression of its thoracic cavity, enters a cascade of physiological crises. As the rib cage collapses, the lungs cannot fully expand. Oxygen intake decreases. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood, causing acidosis. The heart, compressed by the surrounding tissue, struggles to pump. Blood pressure drops. Organs begin to fail. Under normal circumstances, unconsciousness would intervene relatively quickly, a mercy granted by the body's own shutdown mechanisms. But the physician's interventions prevented this natural progression. Small amounts of stimulants were administered, compounds whose exact nature remains unknown, but whose effects were clear. When Margaret showed signs of slipping toward unconsciousness, these substances would pull her back toward awareness. Her eyelids would flutter open, her fingers would twitch. The fog of hypoxia would temporarily clear, leaving her once again fully present in her body, fully capable of experiencing every sensation of her dying. This was the darkest application of medical knowledge, the perversion of the physician's oath. Do no harm had become prolong harm, extend suffering, prevent the escape of death. The intervals between weight additions had been carefully calculated. Too rapid an increase would cause death through catastrophic injury, organ rupture, or cardiac arrest. Too slow, and Margaret might adapt, her body finding ways to compensate for the pressure. The prescribed schedule, 4 to 6 hours between additions, was designed to maintain maximum suffering while preventing premature death. Each new load was substantial enough to cause increased distress, but not quite heavy enough to trigger immediate system failure. It was torture by increments, death by degrees, suffering as a managed process. By mid-afternoon of the second day, Margaret had been under the press for more than 30 hours. The physical damage was extensive and irreversible. Multiple ribs had fractured, their jagged ends visible beneath her skin, puncturing into the soft tissue beneath. Her lungs were filling with blood and fluid, each breath a desperate, gurgling struggle. The pressure on her abdomen had begun to affect her internal organs, causing them to herniate and compress. Yet the physician declared her still viable for continuation. More weights were added. The door groaned. Margaret's body sank lower against the platform, the flesh compressing, the bones bending beyond their natural limits. What is perhaps most remarkable about the witness accounts from this period is their consistent mention of Margaret's voice. Even as her body failed, even as breathing became nearly impossible, she continued to pray. The words were barely audible, whispered fragments of Latin, but they continued, Ave Maria, gratia plena, Holy Mary, full of grace. The rosary recited one agonizing breath at a time. This was not hysteria or delirium, witnesses insisted, but lucid devotion. Margaret knew where she was, understood what was happening to her, and chose to spend her remaining consciousness in prayer rather than pleading or cursing. The crowd's reaction had evolved significantly by this point. The initial mix of hostility and curiosity had given way to something more complex. Hardened men wept openly. Women shielded their children's eyes while unable to look away themselves. Even some of the soldiers guarding the platform appeared shaken. There were reports of conversions, of Protestants crossing themselves and murmuring Catholic prayers they thought they had forgotten. The spectacle intended to terrify was instead inspiring a kind of horrified awe. Margaret was becoming, before their eyes, not a warning but a martyr, her suffering lending her a terrible sanctity. As night fell on the second day, the authorities faced a dilemma. The execution was not proceeding as planned. Rather than breaking Catholic resistance, it seemed to be strengthening it. The crowd's sympathy for Margaret was palpable and potentially dangerous. There were whispers of rescue attempts, of sympathizers planning to storm the platform and end her suffering. Additional guards were brought in. The decision was made to continue regardless, to see the punishment through to its intended conclusion. Margaret would remain under the press until she either pleaded or died, no matter how long it took. The machinery of prolonged death would not be stopped by public sentiment or moral qualm. The third day, breaking point and transcendence. The dawn of the third day revealed a scene of almost surreal horror. Margaret Clitherow had now endured 48 hours beneath the crushing weight, her body grotesquely deformed by the sustained pressure. The wooden door that covered her had sunk several inches into her torso, the flesh compressed to the point where bone and organs were visible through splits in her skin. Her face had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the features distorted beyond recognition. Her lips had turned a dark purple, almost black, and blood had begun to seep from her mouth, nose, and ears as internal hemorrhaging progressed. Yet her chest still rose and fell, however shallowly, and her eyes still tracked movement around her. The physician's morning examination took longer than usual. He seemed troubled, his professional demeanor cracking as he assessed the extent of the damage. Margaret's pulse was thready and irregular. Her breathing had deteriorated to the point where each inhalation required visible effort, the muscles of her neck straining, her body convulsing with the attempt. Blood pressure had dropped dangerously low. Multiple organ systems were in failure. By any reasonable medical standard, death should have already occurred. That Margaret remained conscious defied the physician's understanding of human physiology. He reported his findings to the authorities, noting that she could not survive much longer, perhaps hours at most. The decision was made to accelerate the schedule. The final weights were brought forward, massive stones that required multiple men to position on the door. This addition, larger than any previous increment, was intended to be conclusive. The combined weight now pressing on Margaret's body exceeded 700 pounds, a load sufficient to crush the life from any human being. The door creaked ominously. Margaret's body compressed further. Several more ribs broke with audible cracks. Her breathing stopped entirely for several long moments, and witnesses thought death had finally come. But then her chest convulsed, drawing in a desperate, shallow breath. She remained alive, incredibly, impossibly alive. It was during this final phase that the most extraordinary accounts emerge, reports so remarkable that some historians have questioned their veracity, though they are documented in multiple independent sources. Witnesses claimed that Margaret began to sing, not the labored prayers that had characterized the previous 2 days, but actual singing, hymns in Latin, rendered in a voice barely above a whisper, but unmistakably melodic. Te Deum laudamus, we praise thee, O God. Salve Regina, hail Holy Queen. How she found the breath for singing when breathing itself seemed impossible remains a mystery, one that the physician himself reportedly could not explain. The effect on the crowd was electric. Those who had been praying quietly now joined her audibly, voices rising in the Catholic hymns that had been forbidden in public worship for decades. The singing spread through the crowd like contagion, hundreds of voices taking up the melodies. Soldiers made no move to stop it, some joining in themselves. For a brief time, Ouse Bridge became an impromptu Catholic service, with the dying woman at its center serving as both priest and sacrifice. The authorities, watching this transformation from execution to mass, realized they had lost control of the narrative entirely. Around the 60th hour, Margaret's singing ceased. Her eyes remained open but unfocused, staring upward at the grey March sky. The physician approached for what would be his final examination. He found her pulse barely palpable, a faint flutter beneath the swollen skin of her wrist. Her pupils were dilated and fixed. Breathing had become agonal, irregular gasps separated by long pauses. She was, in medical terms, actively dying, her body finally surrendering to the catastrophic injuries it had sustained. But she was still conscious, still present, trapped in the collapsing architecture of her own flesh. Then, according to multiple witnesses, Margaret spoke. Her lips moved, forming words that were barely audible, forcing those nearby to lean close to hear. She was speaking the names of her executioners, the men who had administered the weights, who had followed their orders without mercy. She spoke their names one by one, and then, incredibly, she said she forgave them, not in anger or resignation, but in what witnesses described as genuine compassion, as if she pitied them more than they should pity her. Some of these men, hardened professionals, broke down weeping at her words. Others fled the platform, unable to continue their duties. Margaret's final words, preserved in several contemporary accounts, though rendered with slight variations, were addressed to God rather than to those around her. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," the same words spoken by Christ on the cross, uttered now by a woman whose suffering had lasted not hours but days. Her eyes closed, her chest rose one final time, held for an impossibly long moment, then fell and did not rise again. After 72 hours of consciousness, of unrelenting suffering, of a body systematically crushed by the calculated application of weight and the perverse intervention of medical science, Margaret Clitherow died. The time was recorded as early afternoon on March 28th, 3 days after the pressing had begun. The immediate aftermath, a city in shock. The moment of Margaret's death brought an eerie silence to Ouse Bridge. The crowd, which had been singing and praying moments before, fell quiet. Even the guards, hardened men accustomed to public executions, seemed stunned by what they had witnessed. The physician approached one final time, checked for pulse and breathing, then formally declared the execution complete. The weights were removed with slow deliberation, each stone lifted, revealing more of the catastrophic damage beneath. When the door was finally raised, Margaret's body was almost unrecognizable, flattened and broken, but her face, witnesses would later testify, bore an expression of peace. Standard procedure for traitors was to display the body as a warning, to let it hang on the bridge or be quartered and distributed to various locations. But something unusual happened with Margaret. The authorities, perhaps sensing the dangerous shift in public sentiment, ordered her body to be removed quickly and buried without ceremony. They wanted no shrine, no rallying point for Catholic sentiment, but the crowd had other ideas. As soldiers attempted to move the corpse, people pressed forward, trying to touch the body, to tear pieces from her clothing as relics. A near riot ensued, controlled only when the body was hastily wrapped and carried away under heavy guard to an unmarked grave. Within hours, the story of Margaret's death was spreading through York with astonishing speed. Eyewitnesses recounted what they had seen, each retelling amplifying the miraculous elements. She had sung while dying. She had forgiven her killers. She had remained conscious and praying for 3 full days. The initial intent to terrorize had backfired spectacularly. Instead of frightening Catholics into compliance, Margaret's execution was galvanizing them. Reports emerged of conversions, of Protestants openly declaring their return to the Catholic faith after witnessing her death. The very soldiers assigned to guard the execution were said to be among those reconsidering their allegiance. The city's Protestant authorities found themselves in an impossible position. They could not deny what had happened. Too many people had witnessed it. They could not spin the narrative effectively. The facts were too stark, the suffering too prolonged, the victim's dignity too undeniable. Attempts to portray Margaret as a dangerous traitor fell flat when confronted with the reality that she was a mother who had died protecting her family, who had spent her last conscious hours in prayer and forgiveness. The propaganda value they had hoped to extract from the execution had inverted entirely, becoming instead a damning indictment of their own methods. In the taverns and marketplaces of York, the execution became the sole topic of conversation. People debated whether Margaret's endurance was miraculous or simply testimony to extraordinary human resilience. Some claimed to have seen her surrounded by light during her final hours. Others reported that the stones themselves had resisted being placed, requiring unusual effort to move. These miracle stories, whether true or embellished, spread rapidly. Catholic families who had been considering conformity to save their lives now found renewed commitment. If Margaret could endure 72 hours of crushing and maintain her faith, surely they could endure fines and social ostracism. Margaret's family faced immediate consequences. Her husband John, though not himself prosecuted, found his business boycotted by some and overwhelmed by sympathy from others. His wife had become famous, a martyr whose name was spoken with reverence in Catholic circles. Their children were taken into the care of Catholic families, hidden from authorities who might seek to complete Margaret's punishment through them. The home where she had sheltered priests became a pilgrimage site, with Catholics making covert visits to pray in the rooms where their martyred saint had lived. The authorities eventually confiscated the property, but by then its significance had already been cemented in the popular imagination. The executioners themselves suffered various fates in the aftermath. Some, troubled by what they had participated in, sought religious counsel. One was reported to have entered a monastery, seeking expiation for his role in Margaret's death. Others defended their actions as following lawful orders, but found themselves socially shunned, their names forever associated with one of the most brutal executions in English history. The physician, whose identity remained officially unrecorded, was said to have left York shortly after the execution, unable to continue his practice in a city that now viewed him with horror and suspicion. But the ripples of Margaret's death extended far beyond York, beyond even England itself. Catholic networks on the continent received news of the execution within weeks. The details were documented, embellished, and circulated through the Catholic diaspora. Seminary colleges in France, Spain, and the Low Countries incorporated her story into their teachings, presenting her as an exemplar of how to face persecution. English Catholic exiles, many of whom had fled similar persecution, found in Margaret's story validation of their own sacrifices. She became, almost immediately, not just a local martyr, but an international symbol of Catholic resistance to Protestant persecution. The pamphlet wars and international scandal. Within months of Margaret Clitherow's execution, the first printed accounts began circulating through Europe. These early pamphlets, produced by Catholic presses in France and the Spanish Netherlands, offered detailed descriptions of her death, drawing on eyewitness testimony smuggled out of England. The most influential of these early accounts was composed by Father John Mush, Margaret's former confessor, who had known her personally and had access to multiple witnesses. His narrative, titled A True Report of the Life and Martyrdom of Mrs. Margaret Clitherow, combined biographical detail with theological interpretation, presenting Margaret as a new Christian martyr in the tradition of the early church. These Catholic pamphlets did not merely recount events. They interpreted them within a framework of religious warfare. England, they argued, had revealed itself as a persecuting power, worse than pagan Rome in its cruelty. The prolonged nature of Margaret's death, the medical interventions to keep her conscious, the calculated escalation of weight, all of these details were emphasized as evidence of deliberate, scientifically administered torture. The pamphlets contrasted Margaret's dignity with the brutality of her killers, her prayers with their violence, her forgiveness with their cruelty. The message was clear. The English Protestant state was tyrannical, and Catholics who suffered under it were martyrs for the true faith. The English government recognized the propaganda disaster almost immediately. Protestant responses appeared quickly, attempting to reframe the narrative. These official and semi-official publications acknowledged Margaret's death, but justified it on grounds of treason rather than religion. She had harbored priests who were agents of foreign powers, conspiring to overthrow the lawful monarch. Her death was a legal execution for a capital crime, not religious persecution. The prolonged nature of the pressing these accounts claimed was her own fault for refusing to plead. Had she simply entered a plea, she would have been tried and, if found guilty, executed swiftly by hanging. Her suffering was self-inflicted stubbornness, not state cruelty. But these Protestant counter-narratives struggled to gain traction, particularly outside England. The image of a mother crushed to death over 72 hours while under medical supervision proved impossible to spin favorably. Foreign observers, even those sympathetic to Protestant causes, found the details disturbing. The Spanish ambassador to France wrote disparagingly of English barbarism. The Pope issued a formal denunciation. Even in Protestant German states, there was discomfort with the methods employed. The execution had given Catholic propagandists a genuine atrocity to highlight, one that could not be explained away or minimized. The diplomatic fallout was significant. England in the 1580s was isolated, facing the Spanish threat and dependent on alliances with Protestant powers and uneasy Catholic states. Elizabeth's government could ill afford to be portrayed as barbarically cruel, yet that was precisely the image Margaret's execution had created. Ambassadors were instructed to downplay the incident, to redirect conversation to Catholic plots and Spanish aggression. But the damage was done. The execution had become a reference point in international discourse about English religious policy, cited as evidence of Protestant extremism and tyranny. The pamphlet war continued for years, with each side producing increasingly elaborate arguments. Catholic writers began comparing Margaret to specific early Christian martyrs, drawing parallels between her pressing and the tortures described in martyrologies. She was likened to Saint Catherine on her wheel, to St. Lawrence on his gridiron, to the countless Christians crushed by Rome for their faith. Protestant writers responded by attacking the veracity of the accounts, claiming that Catholic sources had exaggerated the duration and severity of Margaret's suffering. She had died quickly, they claimed, within a few hours, and the stories of 3 days of consciousness were pious fabrications. The truth, as preserved in the trial records and contemporary English sources, contradicted the Protestant denials. The execution had indeed been prolonged, lasting from the morning of March 25th until the afternoon of March 28th. Multiple Protestant witnesses confirmed the duration and the medical supervision. The government's own record showed payments to the physician for his attendance over multiple days. When these documents occasionally leaked or were stolen and smuggled abroad, they provided irrefutable confirmation of the Catholic accounts, further damaging England's international reputation. Beyond the immediate propaganda battle, Margaret's death influenced broader theological and political discussions. Catholic theologians used her case to argue for the moral superiority of their faith, pointing to the willingness of Catholics to die rather than compromise their beliefs. Protestant theologians, uncomfortable with the optics of the execution, began articulating more sophisticated arguments about the separation of political treason from religious dissent, attempting to carve out space for persecution of Catholic political activities, while theoretically allowing freedom of conscience. These arguments would eventually influence Enlightenment thinking about religious tolerance, though that was far in the future. Legal reforms and the beginning of change. Margaret Clitherow's execution, particularly its prolonged and medically supervised nature, had inadvertently exposed a fundamental problem with peine, forte et dure as a legal procedure. The punishment had been designed as coercive, meant to force a plea so that trial could proceed. It was supposed to be brief, uncomfortable enough to break resistance quickly. But Margaret's case demonstrated that the procedure could be transformed into something far darker, a method of prolonged torture masquerading as legal process. Once that potential had been revealed, once the precedent of medical intervention to extend suffering had been established, the punishment's theoretical justification collapsed. English legal minds, particularly those uncomfortable with the more extreme applications of religious persecution, began to question peine, forte et dure more openly. Some argued that it violated fundamental principles of English law, that punishment should be proportionate, and that torture, officially banned in England except by special warrant, was being conducted under legal cover. Others focused on the practical problems, the bad publicity, the way the procedure could create martyrs rather than breaking resistance. The debate was cautious and conducted largely in private, as open criticism of established legal procedures could invite charges of disloyalty. The immediate reforms were modest. In cases where peine, forte et dure was applied in subsequent years, there are indications of modified procedures. Physicians were not routinely appointed to supervise. Weight additions followed less aggressive schedules. Most significantly, authorities became more willing to accept silence as an implicit guilty plea, proceeding to trial even without formal pleading, and thus avoiding the pressing entirely. These changes were not formally codified, but emerged as informal practice, judges and officials seeking to avoid repeating the Margaret Clitherow debacle. The broader question of whether pressing should be abolished outright gained traction more slowly. Conservative legal opinion held that ancient procedures should not be lightly discarded, that the law's stability depended on maintaining traditional forms. But the mounting criticism, both domestic and international, made retention increasingly difficult to justify. By the early 17th century, use of peine, forte et dure had become exceptionally rare, applied in only a handful of cases and never with the extremity seen in Margaret's execution. The procedure was dying through disuse, too embarrassing to employ, even if technically legal. The formal abolition of peine, forte et dure came in 1772, nearly 2 centuries after Margaret's death, when Parliament finally legislated that refusal to plead would be treated as a guilty plea, making the pressing procedure obsolete. The law's preamble did not mention Margaret by name, but legal historians have noted that her case was referenced in the parliamentary debates leading to the reform. The memory of her prolonged death, kept alive through Catholic commemoration and periodic retelling, had become part of the legal consciousness, an example of what could go wrong when archaic procedures were applied with zealous efficiency. But Margaret's influence on legal development extended beyond the specific question of pressing. Her case became a reference point in broader debates about the limits of state power in punishing dissent. As England moved toward greater religious tolerance in the late 17th and 18th centuries, Margaret's story was invoked by those arguing that conscience should not be punished with death, that religious belief did not constitute treason, that the state should distinguish between political actions and private faith. These arguments did not always prevail, but they gained ground incrementally, and Margaret's martyrdom was repeatedly cited as evidence of the need for reform. The international dimension of the legal impact should not be underestimated. English law, particularly its common law tradition, influenced legal development throughout the British Empire and later former colonial states, including the United States. The revulsion against peine, forte et dure contributed to broader skepticism about torture and cruel punishments that found expression in constitutional protections. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, was drafted against a background of knowledge that included cases like Margaret's, examples of what should never be allowed to occur under color of law. Modern legal scholars studying the evolution of human rights protections sometimes trace lines of influence from specific historical atrocities to modern legal principles. Margaret Clitherow's execution is one such touchstone case. It demonstrated that legality alone does not confer moral legitimacy, that procedures authorized by law can still constitute torture, that the calculated application of medical knowledge to prolong suffering represents a particularly heinous abuse of power. These lessons, learned at the cost of her 72 hours of agony, became embedded in the legal consciousness of subsequent generations, shaping the development of humanitarian principles in law, canonization, and religious memory. For Catholics, Margaret Clitherow's death was not simply a tragedy or even merely a martyrdom. It was a sacred event, a demonstration of faith under the most extreme duress imaginable. In the centuries following her execution, her story was preserved and transmitted through Catholic communities, both in England and abroad. Handwritten accounts circulated among recusant families, her name invoked in prayers for those suffering persecution. She became, alongside other Reformation martyrs, a pillar of English Catholic identity, a reminder that their faith had been maintained at terrible cost and should never be surrendered lightly. The process of formal canonization, through which the Catholic Church officially recognizes saints, is lengthy and rigorous, requiring extensive documentation of the candidate's life, verification of martyrdom, and often proof of posthumous miracles. Margaret's case, though strong on martyrdom, faced obstacles. The records of her life were fragmentary, filtered through Protestant authorities hostile to her cause. The contemporary Catholic accounts, while detailed, were viewed with some skepticism due to their partisan nature, and the miracles attributed to her intercession, while numerous according to tradition, were difficult to verify with the standard of evidence the Church required. Nevertheless, her cause proceeded gradually through the centuries. In 1886, exactly 300 years after her death, Pope Leo III beatified Margaret along with other English martyrs of the Reformation era. Beatification, the step before full canonization, recognized her as blessed and worthy of veneration, though not yet officially a saint. The ceremony, conducted in Rome, was attended by English Catholic exiles and descendants of recusant families for whom the recognition represented vindication after centuries of marginalization. Margaret's story was now not just preserved in private memory, but acknowledged by the Church's highest authority. The final canonization came in 1970, when Pope Paul VI declared Margaret and 40 other English and Welsh martyrs to be saints. The timing was significant, occurring during a period of renewed Catholic-Protestant dialogue following the Second Vatican Council. The canonization was not intended as a Protestant rebuke, but as a recognition of a shared Christian heritage of suffering and witness. English Protestant leaders generally accepted the canonizations gracefully, acknowledging the historical reality of religious persecution on both sides. Margaret was now St. Margaret Clitherow, her feast day established as March 25th, the day her pressing began. The impact of her canonization on Catholic devotion was substantial. Churches dedicated to her memory were established, particularly in York, where her ordeal had unfolded. The site of her execution became a pilgrimage destination, marked by plaques and memorials. Her relics, fragments of bone preserved through the centuries, were enshrined in various locations. Prayer cards bearing her image and story were distributed widely. For Catholic schoolchildren, Margaret became one of the familiar saints, her story taught as an example of courage and faithfulness. She had achieved what the authorities of 1586 had desperately tried to prevent: eternal commemoration and veneration. Beyond formal Catholic devotion, Margaret's story found broader religious resonance. Christian denominations across the spectrum, even those theologically distant from Catholicism, could recognize in her story universal themes: the courage to stand for belief, the willingness to sacrifice for family, the dignity maintained in the face of cruel suffering. Ecumenical services in York sometimes included commemoration of Margaret alongside Protestant martyrs, acknowledging that the religious conflicts of the 16th century had produced victims on all sides, and that modern Christians could honor their courage without endorsing their era's divisions. The theological interpretation of Margaret's martyrdom has evolved over time. Early accounts emphasized her suffering as redemptive, participating in Christ's passion, her crushed body mirroring his crucifixion. Later interpretations focused more on her example of lay holiness, a woman not in religious orders but living an ordinary family life, who nevertheless achieved sanctity through extraordinary faithfulness. Modern Catholic theology emphasizes her as a witness to conscience, someone who followed the dictates of her informed conscience even unto death, an example relevant to contemporary debates about religious freedom and individual moral responsibility. Margaret's iconography in Catholic art typically depicts her beneath the pressing door, often with stones piled upon it, her hands raised in prayer, her face serene despite the obvious suffering. This image, repeated in paintings, statues, and stained glass windows, has become instantly recognizable to Catholics familiar with the English martyrs. Some artistic representations include details from the witness accounts, the physician monitoring her, the crowd praying with her, the bridge setting. These visual depictions have helped preserve her story, making it accessible to those who might never read the written accounts, but who absorb the narrative through sacred art. Modern echoes, execution debates, and human rights. In the 21st century, Margaret Clitherow's execution might seem a relic of a barbaric past, irrelevant to modern concerns. But her story continues to resonate in contemporary debates about capital punishment, particularly regarding questions of prolonged suffering and the role of medical professionals in executions. The parallels are sometimes striking. Just as a physician monitored Margaret to keep her conscious during crushing, modern execution protocols in some jurisdictions involve medical personnel to establish intravenous lines for lethal injection, to monitor vital signs, to ensure the procedure follows protocol. The ethical questions raised are fundamentally similar. Should medical training be applied to make death more efficient, more controlled, more prolonged? Legal challenges to execution methods in the United States have sometimes referenced the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Eighth Amendment, arguing that certain procedures cause unnecessary suffering. In these cases, historical examples of what constitutes cruel punishment are examined. Peine forte dure, and specifically Margaret Clitherow's execution, appears in some of these legal briefs and scholarly analyses as an example of what the framers of the Constitution sought to prevent. The argument is not that modern lethal injection is equivalent to pressing, but that the principle of preventing intentional prolongation of suffering has deep historical roots, traceable to cases like Margaret's. The controversy over botched executions provides another modern parallel. When lethal injection procedures go wrong, when the condemned remains conscious longer than intended, when suffering is visible and prolonged, Margaret's case is sometimes invoked. Just as her pressing was supposed to be brief but was deliberately extended, modern execution protocols are designed for rapid death but sometimes fail, resulting in prolonged consciousness and distress. The debate over whether such failures constitute cruel punishment echoes the historical debates over whether peine forte dure was legitimate legal procedure or torture disguised as law. Medical ethics organizations have drawn clear lines regarding physician participation in executions, citing the fundamental incompatibility between healing and killing. The American Medical Association, among others, prohibits members from participating in executions beyond certifying death after the fact. The historical precedent of physicians being used to prolong suffering, as in Margaret's case, is explicitly referenced in these ethical guidelines as an example of the perversion of medical knowledge. The unnamed physician who monitored Margaret's pressing has become a cautionary figure, an example of what medical professionals must never allow themselves to become. Human rights organizations concerned with torture and cruel treatment have also found Margaret's case instructive. When examining state-sponsored suffering, when analyzing the bureaucratization of cruelty, when discussing the legal frameworks that enable abuse, her execution provides a historical case study. It demonstrates how torture can be legitimized through legal process, how medical science can be corrupted to serve punitive goals, how prolonged suffering can be normalized through official procedure. These lessons remain relevant in a world where torture persists, albeit usually not under formal legal sanction, as in Margaret's case. The question of conscience that Margaret's case raised also continues to resonate. She refused to plead because doing so would have required her family to testify against her, and she could not in conscience cause them that moral injury. Modern debates about conscience rights, about the limits of state power to compel actions that violate deeply held beliefs, sometimes reference historical cases of conscience-based resistance. Margaret's choice to suffer herself rather than implicate others represents an extreme but clear example of conscience prioritized over self-preservation, a principle that remains relevant in discussions of whistleblowing, civil disobedience, and resistance to unjust authority. Educational use of Margaret's story has increased in recent decades, particularly in human rights curricula and in legal education. Her case appears in courses on the history of torture, the development of humanitarian law, and the evolution of execution methods. Students examining her story are confronted with uncomfortable questions. What makes suffering cruel? Is legality sufficient to make an action morally acceptable? How do we judge historical figures who participated in systems we now view as abhorrent? These questions, provoked by her case, help students develop more nuanced understanding of justice, legality, and human dignity. Perhaps most powerfully, Margaret's story continues to inspire resistance to unjust power. For those facing oppression, whether religious, political, or social, her example of sustained courage resonates across the centuries. She has been claimed by various movements as a symbol religious freedom advocates, opponents of capital punishment, feminists highlighting women's strength, and human rights activists opposing state cruelty. Each group finds in her story elements that speak to their concerns, demonstrating the enduring power of one woman's refusal to submit, maintained through 72 hours of unimaginable suffering as a testament to human dignity and resilience. The weight of memory, conclusion, and reflection. 439 years have passed since Margaret Clitherow died on Euse Bridge in York, crushed beneath weights calculated to prolong her suffering. Nearly 4.5 centuries separate us from that cold March day when a woman's body was methodically destroyed while physicians ensured she remained conscious to experience every moment. Time has transformed York itself, the bridge rebuilt, the toll booth long gone, the city expanded far beyond its medieval walls. Yet the memory of what happened there persists, refusing to be buried as completely as Margaret's body was hastily interred in an unmarked grave. The persistence of her story invites reflection on why certain historical events transcend their immediate context to become permanent fixtures in collective memory. Margaret's execution was not, in the cruel calculus of Reformation Europe, particularly unusual in its lethality. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, died for their faith during this period, both Catholic and Protestant, executed in various ways for the crime of religious dissent. What distinguishes her case is not the fact of her death, but its manner, the calculated prolongation, the medical intervention, the transformation of execution into extended torture under color of law. This distinction mattered then, and continues to matter now. We are left with uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the limits of state power. The authorities who ordered Margaret's prolonged pressing believed they were acting lawfully, following established procedure, serving the interests of state security. They would have been genuinely baffled by the suggestion that their actions constituted torture. After all, they were simply applying traditional punishment for a traditional crime. This disconnect between legal authorization and moral horror is what makes her case so relevant to modern concerns. It demonstrates that legality alone cannot be the measure of justice, that procedures sanctioned by law can still be profoundly wrong. The role of the physician in Margaret's execution deserves particular scrutiny. This unnamed practitioner, whose knowledge was supposed to serve life, instead became an instrument of death, his skills deployed not to heal, but to ensure maximum suffering. His interventions, keeping Margaret conscious when her body sought the mercy of unconsciousness, represent a perversion of medicine that should haunt the profession. Modern medical ethics have learned from such cases, establishing clear boundaries about physician participation in punishment. Yet the lesson had to be learned, and it was learned in part through revulsion at cases like Margaret's. Margaret herself, as we can reconstruct her through the historical record, remains somewhat enigmatic. The accounts we have were written by those who wished to commemorate her martyrdom, and they naturally emphasized her sanctity, her courage, her unwavering faith. We know less about her doubts, her fears, her moments of weakness if she had any, but perhaps that incompleteness is fitting. She did not choose to become a historical figure or a saint. She chose only to follow her conscience, to protect her family, to remain true to her faith. That the choice led to 72 hours of agony was not her desire, but her fate, imposed by authorities who thought they could break her will through breaking her body. They failed, of course. Margaret did not plead. She did not recant. She died as she had lived, faithful to her beliefs, protective of her family, dignified in the face of cruelty. Her refusal to be broken became the foundation of her legacy, the reason her story has endured when thousands of other execution victims have been forgotten. There is something in human nature that responds to such examples, that finds inspiration in courage maintained under impossible circumstances. We need such stories, perhaps, as reminders of what humans can endure, of how dignity can be preserved even when the body is destroyed. The broader implications of Margaret's case for understanding human rights cannot be overstated. Her execution represents a moment when the mechanisms of state power revealed their capacity for calculated cruelty, when the potential for abuse inherent in any system of punishment was made horrifyingly explicit. The reforms that eventually followed, the abolition of pressing, the development of protections against cruel punishment, the establishment of ethical guidelines for medical involvement in executions, all of these can be traced in part to the shock and revulsion that cases like Margaret's generated. Progress in human rights often comes not from abstract philosophizing, but from confronting concrete horrors and resolving that they must never be repeated. As we conclude this account, we must acknowledge that Margaret Clitherow's 72 hours of conscious suffering remain, even after 4 centuries, almost incomprehensible in their extremity. We can recite the facts, describe the procedure, document the medical interventions, but we cannot truly grasp what it meant to experience that prolonged destruction of the body while the mind remained aware. The very attempt to imagine it defeats us, our minds recoiling from the horror. Perhaps that unbridgeable gap between description and experience is itself significant, a reminder of the limits of our capacity to understand suffering we have not endured. We can honor Margaret's memory, study her case, draw lessons from her ordeal, but we cannot truly know what she experienced. That knowledge died with her mercifully on that March afternoon in 1586, when her heart finally stopped and her consciousness was released from a body crushed beyond repair. Her suffering ended at last, her witness complete, her place in history secured through the very cruelty that sought to erase her example, but instead ensured it would be remembered forever.